Guys can all grab a seat. So glad you guys are here. Yeah, as Andrew said, we are a new church plant, and I feel like every week there's kind of new people who are coming and find out about us, and so super glad you're here and just honored you'd come hang out with us. If you got a Bible, pull it out. We're in Matthew 5, and while you guys are getting there, I'll give you a little bit of a window into my week. I'm a little bit sick, not crazy sick, not like too sick to be here, but just too sick to really be preaching, but I'm doing it anyway. So anyway, this week, man, it was so fun. I feel like Silas, he's been learning how to cough, like covering his mouth, but he's 3, right? And so it's like 2 out of 3 he'll catch in his hand, and then the third one just shoots like right into your eyes. And so like all week, my immune system was like, block. And then at the very end, got me. So I'm a little bit under the weather. But one thing that's funny about Silas is it's not just coughing into my eyes. He is like he is somebody who wants to be like his dad, right? And it's pretty fun. It's pretty cute. This is a pretty normal, a normal picture of Silas on the average weekend. Here, I'll throw this up. There he is. So we're remodeling our house. It's a pretty significant remodel. So a lot of weekends I've got a tool belt on, and Silas was like, I want to be like dad. And so this is him, right? In his element. And, you know, Silas, he really does. He follows me around. He's not, I would say, not great at helping yet. Honestly, it's kind of counterproductive, but I feel like later in life, I'll be glad that, we had this time together. And the reason that Silas does this, right? He puts a tool belt on, he grabs his drill, he does these things because he's watching me do it. The reason he does that stuff isn't because he's like, man, I want so badly to become the kind of person that is like this guy so that eventually I can like be loved by him, be in his family, and maybe be called his son someday, right? That's not why he does it. He wears that stuff and he dresses like that and he does the things I do because he recognizes, no, this is who my dad is, and therefore I want to be like him, right? And so that's what he does. He's not trying to become something. He's just like, no, I am something. This is who I am. So I'm going to try to be like him. And you know, I think when we think about the law of God, right, because you read this book, and I don't know how familiar you are with it, but there's a lot of stuff it says that we should do, right? You open it up and it's like, hey, you should do these kinds of things. You should be this kind of person. And I think a lot of us, what we do is we take the Bible and we say, man, the Bible is like a description of the kind of person that if you do a good enough job kind of being like this, or you do a good enough job kind of following these rules, then eventually God might be happy enough with you to include him in your family. And it's not like that. It's not what it is, right? The Bible actually has something different. It says, actually, what's happening is, and you just let me know if I need to grab a mic, we'll do that. But it's not what's happening. God basically says, hey, no, I am your dad. I am your God. We have this relational thing, and now I'm giving you a description of my character so that you can know how you should live as my son or as my daughter. And it's so funny, even if you go back to the 10 Commandments, this is actually how the 10 Commandments start. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Most of you know the 10 Commandments, but what's the very first thing God says? Very first thing. Yep. And so this is what a lot of people say this. They say, well, the first commandment is this: you shall have no other gods before me. And if you're like a good Christian who's been to school, you know that one, right? You're like, okay, no other gods, no other idols. But right before that, I call this like command 0. This is what it says. He says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So the whole basis of God even giving his people the 10 Commandments is saying, hey, you were in slavery, and I chose you as my people. I called you forth. I brought you into relationship, into freedom, into this place with me as your God and as your Father. And now out of this place of relational safety, then come the commands. And it isn't just that like the relationship precedes the commands, but actually the relationship is the reason for the commands, because it's actually in following the laws of God, we find ourselves experiencing this relationship, its unity, this unity with the one whose character we are chasing. Now, we're in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, and the first section of the Sermon on the Mount is interesting because what Jesus is doing is he's kind of helping to teach them about the law. How do you relate to the law in the Old Testament? How do you relate to kind of God's words today? And the law that God gave to his people on Mount Sinai, the law that God gave to his people through Moses, here's what the law was, right? The law was this reflection of the character and heart of God. That's what it was. It wasn't just something that was meant to like shape their lives. It was meant to shape their understanding of who God was. And when these people lived their life according to the law, then their lives would be this reflection of the character and heart of God to the world. But there's this problem, right? And the problem is people aren't like God, right? And if you're in the room, you're like, yeah, that's true, right? Like people aren't like God. Our heart isn't like his. And our minds aren't like his. And his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. And so what happened was over the years, the people of God began to take the laws of God that were meant to kind of expose us to God's character and his heart. And instead of being exposed to who he is, the religious leaders of the day, the teachers, began to use the law like a list of rules that you could use to expose your own goodness and your own moral superiority. And, this is not a problem with the law, right? This is a problem with how people are using the law. And the reason that this is a problem isn't just because you distort and kind of tweak the laws of God to fit yourself, but actually if you end up like distorting and tweaking and misunderstanding the laws of God, what actually will end up happening is you will begin to misunderstand the one who they're supposed to represent. And so if the laws and rules reveal who he is, and we interpret those laws to fit us, not God, we end up slowly starting to believe that God is just like us as well. And this is a problem because, as we already covered, God's not like us. And so what Jesus is doing in this section is he isn't just trying to show us like the actual meaning of God's laws. Part of what he's trying to do is clear away the fog a little bit, and he's trying to give us a clear picture of who God is, what he's like. And the thing he wants to talk to us about, three things: our words, our rights, and our love. Okay? Now go to verse 33. This is Matthew 5. Matthew 5:33. He's kind of in the middle of this. Last week, Andrew taught, and by the way, it was awesome. If you weren't here, you need to go back and listen to that sermon. It was really, really good. He's continued to talk about anger, talked about lust, and now he's going to talk about our words. Look what he says in verse 33. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, whether by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head either, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So he's like, I want to talk to you about your words, and more specifically, like your faithfulness to your words. Now, he's talking about oaths. Now, when's the last time anyone took an oath in here? It's not a normal thing, right? That's not like a normal thing we do. We promise stuff, but most of us aren't like, I swear by like the hair on my head, or like by the great city of Ann Arbor, right? Like we don't normally do that. But this is like a thing they did, right? And oaths were a thing because over time we all demonstrate that when we just simply say yes or no to something, we can't always be trusted, right? You feel that about other people in your life? You're like, hey, you said you'd come to my party, and then you went to someone else's party, right? It's like when someone says they're going to do something you can't necessarily trust they're going to. This isn't just a problem with other people, it's a problem with us. And so an oath isn't just a promise, but you make like a promise, and by doing this, you actually invoke something that is precious or powerful that's meant to like add weight to your words. And the law in the Old Testament basically said, hey, man, if you take an oath, you are like required to fulfill it. Like you need to fulfill your oaths. And that's a pretty hard thing to hear if you're a human being, because we're really bad at keeping our promises, right? And so what people did is they started to make this distinction. Well, what's the oath on, really, right? And so they began this kind of distinction and said, well, you make an oath that involves God, that's really serious. Like you don't want to do that because then you're going to have to do it. But so you make an oath by heaven, right? And it isn't really as serious as God himself. And so maybe you do it most of the time, but if something really comes up, you don't have to do it. Or maybe we'll swear by our own heads. And it's like swearing by something not nearly as serious as a God or anything he has to do with. And so we know that we need to keep our oaths, and there are some oaths that are more serious than others, but the goal is really just to take our word as seriously as the thing we kind of invoked it on. And basically these people thought, well, we do that very well. Like I keep all my oaths that are to God, but the ones that are on my own head, I mostly keep most of the time. And here's what he's saying. He's saying, well, here's the problem with that line of thinking. Whether you swear by heaven or by earth or by your own head, it's saying actually everything in the universe belongs to God. And so it doesn't matter what you swear by, all of it eventually ties back to the one who sits on the throne. And he goes, but forget about all of that. Here's just what I want to be true of you. I want your yes to mean yes, and I want your no to mean no. And you don't need to worry about anything else. Like anything else you tie onto that is like from evil. It's not helpful. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. And let's just for a minute just sit on that. How many of you would say, like, I am a truly faithful person to the things I say I will do or won't do? I'm going to be honest. This is one of the areas of the Bible I think I have been most convicted over the last 5-6 years. Me and Steph, like everyone, right? We've got certain tension points in our relationship. And it was a couple years ago where I was realizing, like, one of the most central ways that I've lost trust with Steffi is I'm not a man of my word. Like, I'm just not. And it's like in little things, right? It'd be little things like, hey, I'll be home at 5. And then it's like, well, that conversation went a little too long. Traffic was, a little more than I expected. Whatever, and it's like, it's 5:15, right? And it's like it's a little tiny thing, right? But it's like I'm saying one thing and I'm ending up doing another. And sometimes that's on me, sometimes it feels like it's on circumstances, but there just began to be this like significant distrust where it was like, oh, I'll take out the trash and the next morning it's still not taken out, right? And it's like there began to be this gap between like the things I would say and the things I would do. And there's this relational distrust that began to kind of form. And it wasn't because of anything about Steffi, it was purely because of me. Like, I'm not somebody who can be trusted. When I say I'll do something, I'll do it. And I don't know if you guys feel that way, but like when I read this, I'm like, yeah, I want that to be true about my life. It's not. It's just not. How does your life kind of bear this out? Does your life kind of demonstrate that you're someone who is like faithful to the things you say or not? And I know some of you in the room are better than this that I. You're like, dude, if I say I'll take out the trash, like guaranteed that will be taken out, right? Like I get that done. And I think we all have this in some areas. Like you might have an area where you're like, no, I actually accomplished that. Or maybe you go, well, even the little things, maybe I'm not faithful, but in the really big things I am, right? So let's think about that together, right? A lot of us in the room were married. And so you took some like really big vows, right? Like you stood up on a stage. So guys, let's just think about this. You stood up on a stage and you said something like, my eyes are going to be yours alone. Like my eyes are only going to be for you. Has your life demonstrated that you are a faithful person to your word? Or what about wives in here? You stood up on a stage and you probably said something like, I will respect my husband. Has your life demonstrated that you are a faithful person to your word? And here's the thing. Unless you're like radically out of touch with who you are and you're not very self-perceptive, you answered no to that, right? Like at some level, you're like failing to uphold the things we say. And it isn't just that we're not trying. I think it's that to be a human being is to be someone who finds themselves in a situation where it's actually very hard for us to be completely true to our promises. And most of us, if we're honest, we can't even manage to completely fulfill the things we promised or made maybe an oath to, right? Like made in a really serious way. But then Jesus comes in and he says, no, I'm not concerned about you just fulfilling your oaths, your promises. I actually want what you say to be so binding and trustworthy that when you say yes, it's always yes. And when you say no, it's always no. He's saying, I want faithfulness and truthfulness to run from the very top to the very bottom of who you are. And the reason he says this is because this is what your Father in heaven is like. Right? He's not just giving us an abstract command. He's saying, no, your dad, the one you're in relationship with, that's what he's like. And I was thinking about this, and I was like, why do we not do this? Or maybe this is like a sermon for me, right? I'm like, why do I not do this? Why do I struggle with this? And I was just thinking through, what are the things that happen in my life that keep me from fulfilling the things I say I'll do? And the first one's easy, like we forget, right? Maybe you're in that place, and you're like, I said I'd do this, and I forgot. It's like, how many times have we just said something, and just because of our memory, we don't do it? But then the other thing is we change our mind. Right? Things that seem right to us yesterday seem wrong today. And so we speak from our heart, but we find that our heart feels one way in one moment and another the next. Or the other thing is sometimes we just lack the power. Like we'll say we'll do things, and then they don't happen. Not because like we're trying, like you wouldn't want to. It's just like we lack the ability to accomplish it, right? Like I said our house would be done now. It's not, right? And it's not for lack of trying, right? It's just lack of ability or power. Or the other reason is maybe we're unwilling to pay the price, right? It's like your words, if you would fulfill them, you know it's going to actually cost you something and you're not willing to pay it. The cost is simply too high. Well, this is what's interesting. God doesn't share any of those things. This is how Numbers describes God. It says, it's so interesting. It says, this is the description of God. God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said and he will not do it, or has he spoke it and will he not fulfill it? It's like there's this massive separation. It's like here's one of the biggest differences between mankind and God. God doesn't lie, ever. It's like, do you know that? Do you know that God keeps every single word that comes from his mouth? There's never been a single promise he didn't keep, a yes he didn't fulfill, a no he didn't adhere to. That through literally the entire aeons of history, everything about his story has demonstrated again and again and again and again that he is completely trustworthy and faithful to all of his words. And if there was only like one thing we knew about God was that, it would be enough to tell us that he is completely and utterly unlike us. He's holy. He's outside of us. He's always faithful. Literally, faithful is his name. And as we run up against this command, right, he's saying like, no, I want faithfulness, truthfulness to go from the very top to the bottom of who you are. You're not just running up against a law. You're running up against a being. You're running up against God. It's a description of who God is. And he's saying, you as his son or as his daughter, you actually need to live like him because that's now who you are as a follower of Jesus. The faithfulness of God to his word is supposed to mark the faithfulness of us to ours. And so maybe some of you have something right now in your life that's like, no, I said I would do this thing, but I'm not. And maybe it's because you feel like you can't or because the cost is too high. This is challenging for me. And I don't know if it's challenging for you, but he just starts there. Here's what I want you to know about your words. But now he's going to move on to our rights. Look at verse 38. I actually think he takes it up a notch. And this is probably a verse you've heard before. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, which, most of us don't have, but it's like a coat. How many of you were like, I got to grab my tunic quick? If someone sues you and takes that, let him have your cloak as well, right? Tunics and cloaks. We probably don't use those. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. And this is how he ends it. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Now, this is so interesting, right? Because he's talking about something that seems like really fair. It's like, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, right? Normal system of justice, right? If someone takes something from you, you're free to like take something of equal value back, right? It's like someone steals from you, you get that amount back. But I, your Lord, I, Jesus, say to you, my followers, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, you need to give them the other, okay? Now, we've heard this, right? This is like, turn the other cheek. And this is one of those passages in the Bible I think we do this with, where even people who are non-Christians, you come in and you're like, what a nice, wonderful saying. If only more people were like that. Turn the other cheek. Here's why I think this is wild. Have you ever been smacked in the face? Like, raise your hand if you're just like, dude, I've been smacked in the face. Anyone? Yeah, some people. Okay. The reason I love this, the reason I love that we just casually throw this out is we're like, turn the other cheek, turn the other cheek. That is a great idea in the abstract. He's not talking about it in the abstract. He's saying when someone walks up to you and smacks you in the face, like, there's maybe nothing more infuriating or maddening that could happen to you in the world. Like if somebody's like, driving their car and they run their car into you, you'd be like, this is a really inconvenient thing. Why'd you do that? You ruined my car. If you got out of the car and then they smacked you across the face, you'd be like, the accident means nothing, right? Like that means nothing now. Like this is everything. Like slapping someone in the face was so degrading and humiliating. Like this isn't just like a modern thing. Like there were laws against this. Like you couldn't do that because it was like as you smack someone in the face, you smacked their honor and respect straight out of their life, right? It's just like done. And so actually if you smacked someone on their left cheek with the back of your hand, you could legally cut off their ear. Like if you ever smacked your ear, like, okay, you go to the court and you're like, okay, you can cut this person's ear off now. That was how serious of an offense being smacked in the face was. And that was with the back of the hand on the left cheek. What Jesus is talking about is actually more severe. There weren't even laws on the books about this. It just assumed if someone opened up their hand and smacked you on your right cheek, one of you was going to die at the end of that, right? It was just the assumption. It's like, that's how you begin a duel, right? Someone at the end of this will die because it's such a serious offense. It's so humiliating and degrading. And that's what Jesus is talking about when he's saying turn the other cheek. It's not a casual thing. I feel like what Jesus is doing is he's saying, hey, what's the most humiliating and hurtful thing that someone has ever done to you? And maybe it was public. I mean, maybe they like eviscerated your reputation amongst everybody that you know. Maybe they lied about you. I mean, maybe it's way worse than that. And what Jesus says is really interesting. He says, hey, don't try to find your own justice for that. Don't. Like, you might look at the law and say an eye for an eye. Like, I've been wronged, and so I want to find a way to go out and find justice for the thing that's happened to me. And he's saying, no, don't do that. Actually, don't seek after your own rights. And it doesn't just say let them off the hook. What it actually says is he says, instead, freely give them more than they were even trying to take in the first place. It's a pretty radical thing. Someone sues you and takes your tunic, which, by the way, is like a really important thing in ancient society. It's like they've taken everything from you, and now they're like, now I'm also going to take like the thing that keeps you warm, right? It's like I'm going to take so much from you that I'm even taking something as basic as that. He's like, hey, don't fight against that. Actually, give them your cloak as well. Or actually, when the Roman enemies, this is fascinating, when it says the 1 mile versus 2 mile thing, like a lot of us, that's kind of lost to history. But what happened was the Romans were this occupying force, right? So this group of, this enemy occupying force is in your land, and Roman soldiers were allowed to take someone that they were oppressing, one of these Jewish people, and they were allowed to make them carry their stuff for a whole mile, okay? It was just like, you're allowed to do that. And so you're in your front yard, whatever, tending your flowers, and somebody who is an occupying oppressor comes up to you and says, hey, I want you to carry all my stuff for a mile. So it's like not just carrying my stuff in his backpack. He's like, no, the weapons of my oppression against you, I want you to carry those for me. That's a pretty degrading thing. And Jesus says, don't just carry it 1 mile, carry it 2. Do it. Do more than they're even asking you to do. What is this all about? Well, I think what Jesus is saying is he's saying, hey, people of the kingdom, my followers, they don't seek just retribution, and they don't even seek fairness. They don't go around trying to enact justice for the wrongs committed against them. Instead, they seek to do good to those who have wronged them. And even maybe more specifically, they entrust their lives and their sense of fairness and justice to their Father who sits on the throne. Because see, these things that he's telling us to do, they're not things that you can do in isolation from the relationship you have with God. They're actually things that he tells you to do that you only can do if you believe there's someone on the throne who has a higher view of justice over your life than you do. And I think we need to be careful here, right? Because I don't think Jesus is advocating like, hey, if you are in a truly abusive situation, you need to stay there. But there's a lot of things in the Bible that say, hey, if you're in a situation like that, and actually some of you might be, I don't think the Bible is saying, hey, you need to stay there and take it. Like if someone's physically assaulting and abusing you, I don't think Jesus is saying you need to stay there. We have freedom to actually protect ourselves. And even as this community, we actually try to help pull ourselves into situations like that. So we need to be careful about interpreting it that way, right? Like even in the last week, right, when it's like, hey, if you look at a woman lustfully, it'd be better if you plucked your eye out, right? Most of us didn't apply that by walking in the next week like, I have an eye patch, right? Like there's reasons that we take these things, and we need like pastoral shepherding to go, okay, like what is Jesus really talking about? We have reason to know from the rest of the Bible that we can actually free ourselves from things that are truly abusive. So that's not what it's talking about. He's talking about a posture of life, though, where you're not someone who tries to find a fair, just way the world for you. He's talking about a posture of life where you really believe that there's someone on the throne who has a higher view of justice than you do, and he is enacting justice on your behalf. Therefore, you don't have to go out in the world and try to find it. And it's so interesting because I think we want to qualify this so much. We want to say, well, I don't know, like there's a lot of situations in life where you just gotta fight for your rights, you know? But listen to what he says. He says, do not resist the one who is, look at his description, evil. He's talking about genuine evil, genuine wrongdoing. And it's hard to figure out what you could qualify about that, right? Evil people who do evil to you, he's saying, don't get back at those people. Don't seek justice. Instead, do something that defies every single part of you and seek to bless them and give them more than what they took from you. If they stole something from you, give them double what they took. If they humiliated you, let them humiliate you even further. If they oppressed you and have taken advantage of you for your labor, then do more than they even forced you to do. And if someone needs something, let them borrow it. If someone asks you for something, give it to them. Let me just ask us all a question, because honestly, this is probably what's happening in a lot of our hearts. It's like, what would happen if we actually did that? Like genuinely, as followers of Jesus, we're coming to Jesus, he's saying, hey, live like this. What would happen if we actually did? Well, I think we all know what would happen, and this is the reason we try to qualify this, or even in our hearts, we find ourselves pushing back against Jesus here, because we all know if we did this, we would get taken tremendous advantage of. And you actually know if you lived this way that seems soft, it seems like you're not fighting for yourself, you're kind of leaning back and letting what happens happen. You know that you would have evil done to you because this world is too broken and filled with malice to actually live this way and not be trampled on in the process. And so honestly, I think we run up against this tension because the question is, do you want to follow Jesus? And I mean, seriously, right? It's a real question. Do you want to follow him? Are you his disciple? Is Jesus your anointed one? Because if he is, these are hard words. Like, I don't think these are light, easy words. And honestly, the more you study them, the more you think about them, the harder they get. And the more you actually try to do them, I think the more difficult they are. And you might be here and you're like, man, this is hard. This is difficult. But you know what? I'm a follower of Jesus. I want to live this kind of life. And so what you end up doing is you like grit your teeth and you just bear underneath this burden and you're like, okay, I know this won't be easy, but I'm going to try to do it. And you go, okay, I can experience loss. I can experience humiliation. I can give to people who wrong me. And you kind of just grit your teeth and you will yourself and your body and your mind to do the things that everything in you tells you not to do. And you go and you find the person that stole from you and you give them more. You find the person that hurt you and you kind of push past your anger and rage and you give them more of your stuff. And you feel in that moment you've done it. It was hard. I mean, it was like impossible, but somehow you overcame and you did the thing Jesus has told you to do. And then Jesus gives you his last and final teaching, and he says, now don't just entrust your justice into God's hands and respond to evil with good. Don't just surrender your rights and give more to the one who has wronged you, but as you do that, love them. Love them. He says, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Our words are rights, but now he wants to talk about our hearts, our love. And this is the last and kind of final teaching of Jesus in this section. And if you're in the crowd and you want to follow Jesus, and you're someone who has experienced a lot of pain in your life from people, this is really hard. And I don't just think it's hard. I think there's some level where it's actually crushing to love your enemies and love them so much that you pray for them. He says that when we do this, that is what demonstrates that we are actually sons and daughters of our Father in heaven. He's saying it's actually this kind of like impossible, selfless, like emotion-splitting love that makes God's children different than the rest of the world, right? Because he says, hey, you know, he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. He says, if you just love those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't even tax collectors do the same? Like if you just greet those who are your brothers, what more are you doing even than the Gentiles? He says, it's not impressive to love someone who loves you, right? And that's like, the world kind of says that, right? It's like, man, if there's someone who loves you and you treat them poorly, you don't love them back, it's like, that's on you. Like, that's not okay, right? Everyone knows that. And he goes, yeah, everybody has this same view of justice, of goodness. And so that's common, way of thinking of the day was you love your neighbor. Why? Because they're your neighbor, but you hate your enemy. And what's so interesting about this, right, is this idea of loving your neighbor, this became like the battleground, right, that God's people had. It's one of the things they asked Jesus, right? They say, Jesus, who is my neighbor, right? Because everyone wants to know, like, Jesus, who am I really required to love? And a neighbor was kind of a tricky thing. It was like, well, I live near them, but they're a jerk. Like, they don't share my customs. Like, I don't know if this person's really my neighbor. And so what Jesus does is he gives them a definition of who they're supposed to love that isn't hard to define at all. An enemy. And there's no one in the room who wouldn't be able to give a rock solid definition for that. Here's a great definition. An enemy. Someone who wants to come into your home and kill you and your family and take all that you have. That's a great definition of an enemy. Not just today, but like throughout all of history. Like someone who is fundamentally against you and your existence. Someone who lives their life to bring you and the people you love harm. That's a pretty good description of an enemy. And while we might struggle to think of anyone who fits this definition in our lives today, these people who Jesus is talking to, they had real enemies, like real enemies that fit that description. They knew what it was like to have people break into their homes and do horrific things. They knew what it was like to have the things that were most valuable taken from them. I'm not talking about televisions and money. I'm talking about sons and daughters and friends. They knew what it was to have enemies, real enemies, and they hated them. And Jesus stands in the midst of this group, in the midst of a group of people who actually have, through their history and their current lives, they've experienced the pain that comes when your enemies actually have power over you. And he says, I'm not just telling you that you must give to them and bless them and not retaliate against them. I'm telling you, you must love them. Is there someone in your life that has wronged you to the point that your whole life is filled with anger and bitterness towards them? No doubt, there are some people in this room who have way more reason to feel that than others. I don't know what's happened in all of your stories. But no matter who we are, Jesus comes to us and he says, you actually don't have that freedom to treat that person like that in your heart. He says you don't actually have the freedom to hate and despise another human being no matter what they have done to you, who they are. And I really do believe, like in this moment, it's like we want to be tempted to come to Jesus and says, Jesus, do you not understand? Like, do you not know what's happened to me? Like, these people, they smuggle bombs into our country to kill us. This person lied about me. They destroyed everything about my reputation in the whole world. This person had an affair with my spouse. They stole the one thing I cared about most. This person didn't stop even when I was telling them no. This person drove home drunk from a bar and killed my son that I loved. And Jesus stands next to you as you look at the person who is your enemy, and he says, love them. Seek what is best for them, work to make their life as good as possible, and actually love them so much, this is crazy, that you pray for them. It's like you take that person that's your enemy, and he's saying, I want you to bring them into like the most central, secret, sacred place that you have, your place of prayer before God, and I want you to put them in the very center of that, and I want you to ask God to make their life better. This is what's so interesting about the Sermon on the Mount is there's like a whole spectrum of beautiful living that everyone in the world can agree about that falls way short of that, right? This isn't just like Jesus is saying, hey, I want you to be a good person. This is like way beyond that. It's different than that. Like what Jesus is talking about is something so different. Like love those who love you. That makes sense. These aren't ways of living for everyone. I think it's actually really important we notice that. Like Jesus isn't actually just looking at like a whole crowd of people. He's looking at people who said, I want to follow Jesus. These aren't just rules for the whole world. These are ways for living for those who have God as Father. Very specific. Remember, the relationship precedes the command. It's ways of living for those who've actually experienced God doing these exact things for them. It's ways of living for people who've already experienced God doing all of these exact things for them. Now, last week, right, Andrew was trying to explain this. He was trying to touch on like, okay, Jesus comes to earth and to live a righteous life in our place, right? That's the whole good news. The whole good news is like, you don't like build an identity by following these rules and then God will accept you. So that's not the point. And so why does God even give us a picture of what a righteous life looks like? And, Andrew was saying, well, it's not for our justification, but it's for our flourishing, right? Like these are depictions of the good life. And that makes so much sense with like lust and anger, right? It's like, don't be angry at all. Don't consume someone with lust. Like we know that's the right kind of life. But now he gets to this place, it's actually pretty hard to agree with, right? And actually, if you read a lot of the philosophers, they'll say like, this is one of the most messed up things about Christianity. This idea of loving your enemies. Like it goes so far beyond what's good and right and moral, and it actually kind of degrades into something that's wrong. But here's what I think Jesus is saying. He's saying the life of flourishing, the blessed life, the life that is good, is actually the life that is spent in the very near presence of a very specific person, Jesus. The reason we turn the other cheek isn't just because this is what good people do. I don't actually think that's true. I think there's like actually a thing of justice that's like out there in the world, but he's looking at people who are saying, if you want to follow me, the reason we turn the other cheek is because that's what Jesus did. And the reason we love our enemies isn't because this is just like the right thing to do in the world. It's because this is what Jesus did for us. These are descriptions of the good life. Is because the good life is a life that's actually lived by the side of Jesus. And he did those things for us. And here's why I think it's so important we actually try to do these. And I mean that. Like if you're here and you're like, what should I try to do? I'd be like, actually, you should try to do that. You should actually try to love your enemies. You should actually try to turn your other cheek. The reason I think it's so important to actually try to live these things out is because there's going to be a moment in your life with these, right? Some of the other things Jesus tells you to do, you might be able to feel like I'm kind of nailing it. Loving your enemies, my guess is there's going to be some point in your life where you are going to hit the limit. You're like, I just can't. I can't produce enough love. I can't bring forth enough of my heart to actually do this. I don't know how to do that. There's going to be some moment where there's enough humiliation, enough degradation from this person, whatever, that you're going to feel like I hit the limit of what I can do towards this other person. And then you see it's in the moment where you actually reach the limit of what you can do, you begin to have an experience with the kind of love God has for you. Because God doesn't have limits like you do. It's only when you reach the limit of being able to follow God into these things, you start to understand the kind of love that he has for you. Because, when God made a promise to bless you and to save you, he did so knowing that being faithful to his word to you would cost him everything. He knew that. All the way back to the beginning of the Bible, he's like, I'm going to fix this. He knew what it was going to cost for him to fulfill that promise. And his words never fail. His yes is always yes, even when his yes cost him his life. And Jesus tells us to turn our cheeks because that's what he did for us, right? When we cursed him, he blesses us. We nailed his feet to a tree. He washed our feet. We put a crown of thorns on his head, and he does that. He walks through that. He receives that so he can put a crown of everlasting gold on ours. We spit in his face, and as we did that, he prayed for us. We tied him to a tree. We kind of enslaved him to this place of horror. And as we did that, he was buying our freedom when we were his enemies. That's when he loved us. And that's when he died in our place. And you see, Jesus is saying, hey, I want you to live like that. I want you to live like that in the world. You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And as I've been thinking about these things, I don't know if these commands or this way of living makes sense to everyone out in the world, but I know that these things make sense for people who've actually met Jesus. This way of living actually makes sense if you're a follower of Jesus, because these are things that flow out of the relationship that we already have. And I was writing down a few of these things because I was like, man, if we did these things, if we tried to live like this, what would happen? And I just wrote down a few things. I want to just read them. I think that if we tried to do this, that we would actually get to experience our union with Christ in a way deeper way. I think that as soon as you put a limit and you say, I'm not going to love past that, I'm not going to love that kind of person, I think what you're doing is you're kind of like not allowing yourself to experience the real union with Jesus, who had no limits in his love. I think if we lived like this, it would actually force us to trust in God's justice instead of our own. It's like if you take your ability to find your own justice and fight for your rights, if you take that out of your hands, what else do you do with it? The only thing you can do is actually put that in God's hands. I think it forces you to do that in a really beautiful way. I think living like this would help us experience the force of God's love for us, because it guarantees that we'll actually meet the limit of our own. And I think living like this, it would begin to actually shape our lives like the one that we follow. I think living like this, it's something that I don't think can be done in our own power. There's a lot of things in the Bible, I think if you grit your teeth well enough, you might be able to do them. I don't think it's possible to do this at all, unless there was some internal power you had that was different than the power of the world, something that actually necessitates you have a real relationship with Jesus and you actually fall in the power of the Holy Spirit. And I think living like this would actually show the world we're truly God's children. Because I think if someone came to you and wronged you in that kind of way, and you responded like Jesus to them, I think they would be blown away. I think they'd be absolutely blown away, and they'd be like, something is different about you. And there's nothing about this that makes sense, except maybe you had someone that did this for you. Maybe you had someone in your life that once did this for you. I don't know if you run into these things like I do, but these things feel hard, feel difficult. But I want to do them. I really want to do them. Like, I want my life to be more shaped like this than it's not. I want to actually come to these things and say, Jesus, I want to follow you in this. And the reason I want to do that is because this is what Jesus is like. And I want to be like him. Like, I don't want to be like him so that I can like claim an identity. I want to be like him because he really is my dad. He really is my friend. I want to be like Jesus. And so I want to pray that as you bump up against this stuff, Jesus would actually make us more and more these kind of people.